Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy, back from the land of flannel and dreams with a review of this, the Sigma 40mm f1.4 DG HSM ART lens, in this case for Sony E-mount, as you can tell by the extended barrel here. This is an oldie but a goodie, and it is by no means an unknown commodity. This lens has been around for a while, but here you are listening to me talk about it, so yay! At any rate, this is a lens that is well regarded generally, but also amongst astrophotographers. So it will be interesting to see how this lens, which was released in 2018, performs some 6 years later, maybe closer to 6.5 in 2024. Still 2024 for a couple of days as I record this. First of all, this is an art lens in the old style of art lenses from Sigma, which is to say it is huge and heavy, and hopefully that means it's really well made. Of course, full metal construction, we've got lots of glass in here, and you know, it's a big lens. So here we have a pedal hood, and it's actually pretty nice. It's got a release button and a rubberized surface close to the attachment point, as well as a knurled portion here above the rubberization, which helps with grabbing it, especially if you're wearing gloves like I was when I tested this, because it's winter in Canada. We have a really, really chunky manual focus ring. It's really well dampened, and it is manually coupled. Ah, I miss those days. This lens does not include a magnetic electronically controlled focus group. It's got a old style ring motor, and that allows it to have this autofocus, manual focus clutch situation here where you can override the AF if you need to, and it gives you a full manual experience. It's really, really nice. That said, there is a AF MF switch here, so you can disable autofocus entirely. We've got a little hyperfocal distance window here if you really want to get old school, and overall just classic art lens. Under the 82mm filter thread is a not quite 82mm front element, but being an f1.4 lens, it is still quite large. Hopefully this front element gives us good performance, maybe lower vignetting, that type of thing. It'll be interesting to see, but it is a big lens. I know I keep saying that, but my arm's getting sore just holding it. If we take off the back cap here, we've got a barely there gasket here. Presumably it's not there for no reason. Presumably that's going to be enough to keep moisture or dust out of your camera, but it is quite minuscule. But all that being said, it's a nice lens, well built. Available at a deal now. I believe that the price was reduced significantly maybe a year or two ago, and you can still buy it new but used as well. So in 2024, soon to be 2025, is this lens worth your money? Well, let's look in Lightroom and find out. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom, where we are of course looking at Sigma's 40mm f1.4 DG HSM ART lens, released in 2018. Only one calendar year before their 35mm at 1.2 for mirrorless mounts. So interestingly enough, this lens came very late in the DSLR to mirrorless switchover for them, and this lens was released for Canon and Nikon DSLRs, as well as Sony, I think L mount probably as well, with a native mount, but it's not a mirrorless lens. That said, it is widely available, which is a good thing, because not every Sigma lens, of course, is available for every system these days, and we won't get into that too much today. This lens has obviously been around for a long time, so I am in some sense retreading some ground, but I've never reviewed it before. Recently found one brand new locally, so here we go. I've got a lot of different samples here. Pretty much everything's tracked, of course, with Fornax Mounts LighTrack II portable star tracker. Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please head over to ferventastronomy.com and you can do so. Almost everything you see in front of you here is taken with the Sony a7R Mark V 60 megapixel sensor in that camera. we're dealing with 60-second track shots and ISO 320 for the ISO. This is an ISO invariant camera. If you want to learn more about that, probably somewhere in the top right-hand corner is going to be a link popping up right about now to give you a chance to watch a video I made on ISO invariance, or if you're the type who likes to read, in the description there's a link back to the website where there's another article linked that explains ISO invariance in great depth. So please, by all means, enjoy that. While you're there, you will find most or all these samples for download full raw for your pixel peeping pleasure. That being said, these are my copyrighted works. I have to buy the lens, put in legwork to do all this. It's a lot of effort, so please respect that. Please just use it to assess the lens's performance and for no other reasons. Thank you very much. We don't have untracked samples today. These are all tracked. This first one here, if you take a look here, you see diffraction spikes. This is taken with a Batinov mask. You may ask yourself, what's a Batinov mask? Well, this is a focusing aid that creates these diffraction spikes and allows you to get perfect focus. When these three spikes are symmetrically aligned on a point light source, such as a star, you are in clinically perfect focus. And you can look at some of the other dimmer stars here and see that the tines line up. Sometimes you can use this to diagnose field distortion, although in a lot of lenses or optics, as you get towards the edges, you do hit vignetting and all kinds of things, and then you'll lose a spike. Unfortunately, we can't use this for that purpose, but here we can see that we are in nice focus in the center. If we come over here, this is the F1.4 sample, wide open, tracked of course, and right away we can see there is some vignetting, darker corners, and that is pretty normal. If we flip back and forth between the 1.4 and 1.6 sample, you can see that there is a bright spot in the 1.4 sample, a hot spot in the center, and as we flip back and forth, it disappears. You should notice, if you look at the navigator here, that at 1.6, it's actually a little bit darker in the center, and then we've got sort of a donut of illumination there. So that's interesting. Sometimes stopping down that little bit can help improve contrast. And in this case, it likely does. If you look at the histogram, left side of the histogram is where the darks and shadows exist. And if things are to darken up all across the frame, we would notice that graph moving to the left. However, as we do shift back and forth between these two, you can see we're cutting in on the right side. This is where the brighter information is, but we're not losing anything on the dark side there. So you can decide whether you'd rather deal with this in post or this. Overall, this mid portion and edges and corners, you're not changing the illumination. Let's pop into the center. And in the center here, we see that we've got some fringing, purple fringing, chromatic aberration on some of the brighter stars here. That's kind of unavoidable with a lot of lens designs. Essentially what's happening is the lens is not actually focusing the blue light and some of the red light into that tight pinpoint. So they're defocused, and that's why they create this fuzzy halo here. They're actually not completely in focus. That said, the fringe can be corrected, the color at least, in post in most cases. Just flipping back and forth between the 1.4 and 1.6 samples, we do see that things darken substantially at 1.6 in the center. And I think, especially if you look at the chromatic aberration, that fringing, we are taking care of some of the light bloom that's causing this loss of contrast. So you might want to consider 1.6 or not, it's up to you. While we're here, let's scroll through 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, F2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8, quite dark. And of course, 2.8, 2.5, F2.2, F2, 1.8, 1.6, 1.4. That gives you a bit of an idea of what you can expect there as far as illumination goes if you stop down. One thing I do want to mention, I was out just before Christmas. This actually clicked over to Christmas Eve, and the reason I was out there is because it was like the first clear night in forever. Although there was some haze and maybe a little bit of cloud that came through here or there. Keeping that in mind, there hasn't been any real serious bloom or anything like that, so I don't think that either the lens nor the conditions were causing too much halation, which is a good thing. This lens has really good optical corrections. Spherical aberrations are not an issue. And in fact, let's look at the MTFs on Sigma's website. So here we have the MTF charts, and I don't want to really stress you out about this too much, but just know that the green lines here are the ones we would be interested in. These are more applicable to higher resolution cameras. The red lines are more applicable to low resolution cameras, less strenuous. They sort of line up here with what's called 10 lines per millimeter or 30 lines per millimeter. You can get 40, 50, 60, etc. But Here, most companies only show 10 and 30. In this case, both the geometrical and diffraction MTFs are pretty similar. So I'll kind of explain what's happening here. Here we've got contrast. And as we go up, you can kind of equate this to image quality or sharpness if you want to. It's not, of course, exactly true, but it's good enough. Image height, you see between 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 millimeters. It'll actually go out here to about 21.5 millimeters. This represents the full frame image circle. And what that means is at this part of the graph, towards 0 is the center of the lens. This part of the graph, it is the edge of the lens. And what we can see here, 0.9, 90% seems pretty good. The line stays pretty okay for the most part and then starts to dip and ends up somewhere around 60 as we get out to the edges and corner of the lens. This is indicating that we're losing contrast at this point about 3/4 of the way in, and things kind of fall off there fairly steeply. And that's not out of the ordinary. This sort of flattish part here is actually the remarkable part. If you look at the two lines, you've got a dashed line and a solid line. If these lines diverge, it's an indicator that you'll start to get astigmatism. And you see as we start to dip towards the edges and corners, the lines do diverge, but not too much. So we're getting a little bit of astigmatism, but not a ton. If we click here, I'm not going to read through this. I'm not going to do that. You can either go to the Sigma Global website and look the lens up and read this if you want, or you can just pause the video and take a look. But here it explains kind of what you're looking at and how to read these graphs. And I'll click on this little thing at the bottom. This is going to give you some glossary information here, a little more information. And again, you can pause if you'd like. But that is a little information on how to do MTFs or how to read MTF graphs. So here what I'm seeing is pretty good sharpness through most of the center of the frame, dropping off towards the edges, and a little bit of astigmatism, but not very bad. So let's see if that bears out. Before moving on from the topic of MTFs, I wanted to bring this up, which I remembered to look at after recording. So this is from lensrentals.com. Lens Rentals was started by a very, studious guy named Roger Cicala, and he was really good about putting out all kinds of different information and doing real-world MTFs. Lens Rentals has a full optical testing system, as you can see here. And so what he's done, this is, 2019, I think, is kind of when this sort of leveled off and stopped happening. So you have mostly DSLR era lenses, but, some mirrorless lenses. But what they would do is they would take all their samples or a bunch of their samples, the real lenses that they have that they rent out. Here we can see 8 samples were tested just about, 6 years ago-ish. And they would run them through the MTF. And these are real world data. This is not the sort of sanitized best case scenario that you'll see from the manufacturer like we just looked at. This is real world stuff. And I would call these more reliable. And of course, they test them to a more rigorous degree as well. 10 line pairs per millimeter, all the way up to 50 line pairs per millimeter. And as we can see, things, we've got 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Here that 30, it's not quite as, let's say, optimistic as the Sigma in-house MTF is, which was, more around here, around 90. Here, we're seeing that it's mostly around this 0.8 value, which is totally good. This is really good, but keep in mind, real world is never what's promised in the marketing material, right? So what we can see is a couple of things. First of all, overall, it stays quite good and then peters off a little bit, just like it did in Sigma's own graphs. However, we can see that these lines diverge earlier, and this is due to a combination of things. The divergence can indicate astigmatism, or it can indicate lateral color shifting, where you're getting that chromatic aberration, but a split, one color on one side outside of a pinpoint or high contrast area, and then a different color on the side that's facing the center of the lens. So here we can see that things do diverge, but they do stay quite even, and then widen a little bit as things kind of take a dip here on the right-hand side. We're using a 60 megapixel sensor, so we're really putting this lens through its paces. So to be perfectly blunt, the 50 line pairs per millimeter is probably the more accurate test. But if we want to compare apples to apples, then we can compare this 30 line pairs per millimeter to the MTFs we just looked at from Sigma. Overall, these are really, really great. Like I don't want to downplay it, but we can see that they do match up with what we're seeing in the lens a little bit more. And we'll see that soon when we look more into the corners. As the lines diverge here, we're going to see a little bit of breakdown in that image quality. So again, center of the frame, pretty good sharpness, nice tight stars. And then let's go to the edge. And here we see we've got a little bit of astigmatism and a little bit of actually field distortion, which we'll talk about here. So what you're seeing here with these stars, and maybe I can find a different example. All right, here's a good example. See these stars? This is astigmatism. Essentially what's happening is these little pinpoints, well, the lens, the further out you get, has hard time actually focusing those pinpoints into pinpoints, and they stretch out in two directions. There are radii, infinite radii, that radiate from the center to the edge of the frame, and every time a pinpoint like a star falls along a point here, it will stretch out in this direction in the case of what's called tangential astigmatism. So all these little stars, they're stretching out. This is not star trailing. If you look in the center here, nice and round, back to the edge here, they're stretching out. That's tangential astigmatism. Now, if you see there's some almost like blue wings on some of these stars, or a little bit of sort of lateral or orthogonal something happening, that's sagittal astigmatism. So that's happening at a 90-degree angle to all these radii. So anywhere along here, if we've got astigmatism, the sagittal astigmatism will be kind of crossing the line made by the tangential astigmatism. So tangential kind of radiates in the center, and sagittal will appear like it's sort of ringing the frame. We're pointing in this general direction like that. So that's what we're seeing here. And admittedly, I've seen way worse. The MTF charts are telling the truth. This lens does not have very bad astigmatism, although it does have some it's hard to get away from. Now, some of you might have had the word coma in your minds when looking at that. That is not coma. Coma is something else entirely. Coma is chromatic aberration. So what is that? Well, it's named after comets. Imagine a comet. Comet has what's called coma, a sort of fuzzy cloud of gas and dust that forms around it when it starts to melt as it comes towards the sun. And that sort of is evocative of these little bits of fuzziness here that you see in some of these stars. So they named this chromatic aberration after coma. What's happening here is that you'll have one part of the pinpoint here, the star, that remains in good contrast, and then the other half will sort of fuzz out. And you see the same here for this star over here. And what will happen is that'll always be along a radius from the center to the edges, just like the tangential astigmatism, although it is a separate phenomena. And if we look at brighter stars, anywhere along this, we will find in this lens that the fuzzy bit points towards the middle. This is called internal coma. Fuzzy bit towards the middle is internal. Fuzzy bit towards the edges is called external coma. So there's a little bit of coma in this lens, but it's not too bad, and it's not very disruptive, so I don't think it's a huge thing to worry about. I think probably the biggest problem for me is field curvature. How you'll experience field curvature in your images is that, let's say you're focused in the center of the image, it's nice and sharp, exactly what you want. You might actually notice that focus falls off as you go towards the edges. In this case, we can see that the stars start to get a little bit bigger. Let's look in this corner here. This is a good indicator. These stars are a little bit bigger than they should be. I know there is some astigmatism, but they're kind of spread out. It's showing me that they're defocused. If we snap to the center, you'll see they're a lot tighter. Back to the edge, a lot blobbier. And this is just a fact of life when using a lens. Your camera's sensor is flat. The lens is made up of curved elements, and these curved things are trying to bend light and focus it on something flat. And as you might expect, what they're able to do in the center is going to be different than at the edges. It's just a fact of life. So here, this is actually pretty strong field curvature, finding it pretty noticeable even at this distance. And where these things start to bother me personally is when they become distracting because the stars in the corners or edges start to look bigger than they otherwise ought to. That's just me personally. That's when myself as a viewer starts to notice things. That being said, because of the low astigmatism, we're not really noticing weird shapes at this viewing distance. So I think this is probably pretty workable. Speaking of corners, let's take a look here. So this is 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2, 2.2, 2.5, and 2.8. And we can see we're really not seeing a ton of change as we scroll through here. Maybe a little bit of tightening up at 2.8. And if we increase the brightness a little bit, we can see that while a little bit of that astigmatism is cleared up, we're really not cleaning up any of that field curvature. these stars remain out of focus. Let's try another corner for good measure. This is 2.8, 2.5, 2.2, 2, 1.8, 1.6, and 1.4. And we can see that maybe as we stop down around 2.5 or 2.8, we can clean up a little bit of sagittal astigmatism, but I don't think we're really getting a ton of improvement overall. Just boost this. And here we can see largely the sagittal astigmatism has gone away. Tangential just hasn't budged. And again, the field curvature is still present, and we still have a little bit of the color fringing here. Yeah, so 2.8, not really doing much to fix things. I can show you actually another example of field curvature here in a moment. First, we are going to look at this sample. In this sample here, we are testing the aperture vignetting of the lens. Happens a lot, especially with fast lenses, which is to say the closer to the edges and corners you get with a bright light source, in this case we have Jupiter, you'll notice if there's aperture vignetting, you'll start to have this weird butterfly shape or lighthouse light shape or something starting to crop up. And what's happening here, you've got this sort of flaring and loss of contrast on each side. It's bilateral, it's pretty symmetrical, it's sort of a mirror image. And then you have these dark chunks that are coming out in the middle, almost like shadows. And this is the in-focus rendition of cat's eye bokeh on specular highlights in more terrestrial settings and uses of the lens. This is a fast lens with a shallow depth of field. When you're using that in close quarters, say in a portrait or something like that, and there's specular highlights in the background, the closer you get to the edges, they'll start to take on kind of a cat's eye shape. And I can demonstrate that to you right here. Here's the same shot, but completely defocused, all the way to the minimum focusing distance. And you can see, here we've got some of these blobs. These represent specular highlights out of focus. And here is our Jupiter blob. It's got this almond shape or this cat's eye shape. And one thing you'll note is you can see this lens has got what we would consider onion ringing or busy specular highlights. So you can actually see concentric circles in here. And you can see very clearly that the center of this should be right here. But and this is the true edge. There's this edge here that's got some yellow fringing, and that's actually cutting it off. So what is this actually representing? Well, this is the results of aperture vignetting when out of focus on a specular highlight. And this bit here represented by this yellow fringe is literally the physical lens itself, the true aperture inside the lens. Even though the blades are wide open, there is still physically a choke point in the lens at that point that represents f1.4, and that is what we are dealing with. And that physical part of the lens is blocking this portion of the light from Jupiter. You can imagine this circle wants to continue, but that light got screened out, physically blocked on its way through the lens. And this ends up giving us this when it's in focus. And there's no real way around it. You can stop down, and this is f1.8. As you see, as we stop down, aperture blades will start to come into play, and they'll start to add more diffraction. And here by f2.8, we're all diffraction spikes pretty much. This is what you might consider a sun star if you're using this lens in a landscape capacity or something like that. You get these tines, diffraction spikes. That is what's going on there. Now, there's not anything you can do about this, really. The closer to the edges, the more apparent it'll be. This will be less apparent here. In the center, it won't be an issue most likely, but as you get further and further away from the center, it'll become stronger and stronger. And I do want to mention, I am focused on Jupiter here in the corner. I am literally focused right here. So the center, remember there is field curvature. You can see the center here is out of focus, and you can see the edge here is in focus. And when we're in focus, this is going to show up really sharp, as well as the actual astigmatism. Here you can see the astigmatism. We've got very clear little airplane shapes almost, where there's tangential and sagittal astigmatism coming into play very clearly. But again, this is focused in the corners, which puts the center out of focus. And on that note, I actually do want to compare it to our previous sample here. And if we zoom in on the center, this is our original sample at f1.4. This is our corner focused sample at f1.4. And you can see when we're in focus in the corners, the center's out of focus. And the opposite is true when we're in focus in the center, the corners will be out of focus. You can see how things here are a little bit bloated as compared to here. Here, this is possibly a little bit of a better view. Here you can see on the left, we've got the focus in the corner, so the stars are a little bit tighter. On the right, the focus is in the center, so the stars are out of focus in the corners here, and they just appear bigger. And like we just experienced, the opposite's true. So that it might be something that you might want to play around with. You could, if we look here to double cluster, you see that we are starting to experience some change in the star shapes. It looks like a bunch of little triangles, albeit you can't really see it from the zoomed out view. But you might want to actually try getting these in focus, focusing for this part of the frame. It might acceptably defocus the center and have an acceptably defocused edge. That could be a way to split the difference, essentially. And I'm going to probably do a separate video on it. That's why I took all these actual samples here, but I'll give you a little preview of what happens when you stop down with the aperture vignetting. So 1.4, 1.6, you can see the blades start to come in on the top and bottom here. But notice the concentric circles. None of this actually changes. You're just cutting off the top and bottom, and that original circumference is still visible there, and the center is still visible, and to such point that you close down enough that you kind of chop off all sides. And, essentially you're not actually imaging the center of the object, just some portion towards the middle or edge of it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Here's a bit of an example. There is a little bit of haze in this shot, but this gives you an example of what you could use this lens for compositionally. Of course, we have Orion here. Bump the exposure up a little bit. You can see there is some cloud and haze here. This is close to the horizon. But this would be interesting. You can get a lot of different stuff in here. All of Barnard's loop, if you were doing it with a modified camera and that type of thing. Actually, worth noting, here is a shot with my modified A7R Mark IV. And as you can see by the complete lack of anything in this frame, there is no internal infrared light pollution in this lens. So this is safe for modified cameras. And if we come back here to our original shot, we'll just go into the develop module and zoom in here. We've got this purple fringing. Remove chromatic aberration, of course, does nothing usually. So we grab our defringe dropper. One click, it'll take away all that purple blue fringing, and we're left with a more natural sky there. And if we enable profile corrections, we'll see a couple of things happen. First of all, there's a lot of vignetting in the corners, and it does reach pretty deep into the center of the frame. When we enable a profile correction, it's really cleaning a lot of that out and putting pretty even illumination through the whole thing. That's nice to see. And if I flip this off and on a couple of times, we can see that this lens out of the box has very, very slight barrel distortion. Essentially, the center is bulging up towards the viewer. The edges are pushed away from the viewer a little bit. So when we enable these corrections, there's a small transformation. It'll flatten the center away from the viewer, pull the corners towards the viewer. And since that's all done in 2 dimensions, we can actually scale the image down here. And you can see what's happening. They're actually pulling the edges and corners out a little bit, but they're mostly leaving the sides of the image alone. And that means that we're not really losing much in the way of field of view. You watch these stars, we're basically not losing anything. And even if we did, it wouldn't have been a big deal anyway. Now, when we have the corrections applied, we can see that in the corners, the stars are bigger. They're just a little bit bigger than their neighbors. It's especially easy to see here, for me at least. This area, the stars appear much bigger than this area. And yeah, that's kind of distracting to me, although it's not by any means the worst I've seen. You might want to put a little vignetting back in just to darken things down and bring the viewer's attention closer to the center. And in all likelihood, no one's ever going to notice. That said, this might be difficult to do panoramas with. It might be hard to stack this portion of an image, overlap it, further into the frame there. So your mileage may vary. This is what I'm seeing on my end. And like I said, this is not a new lens by any means. I really hope that Sigma considers releasing a mirrorless native version. That would be really amazing to see, especially with a little refinement in the formula. I could see maybe even clearing up some of that field distortion would make this lens close to perfect. Nothing's perfect, but pretty close. And yeah, overall, you can still find this lens here and there. A lot of astrophotographers are really interested in it, obviously, due to its performance and general flatness across the frame. So if you are looking at this lens and interested in it, I hope this little review has helped you. But thanks for hearing me out. Let's pop out of Lightroom and wrap this up. Well, you know what? No lens is perfect, and this lens is no different. It is, of course, a well-made lens. It's got a very unique spot amongst lenses. I don't think there's another 40mm f1.4 full frame lens on the market. So it is a compelling choice. I given the hype, I really do wish that the optical performance was a little bit better. The astigmatism was, really well controlled, but that field curvature is just a little bit, it's like a little bit too much for my personal hopes and dreams, especially given how this lens has been talked up over the years. I know some of you might be going, bad copy, bad copy. Here's the thing. If I can buy it from the store, like I did with this, it shouldn't be bad. They should be at a minimum level of performance, and I can only assume that this is at the minimum level of performance that the company finds acceptable. So in this case, given what this lens is designed for and given the MTFs and stuff, like, it's not surprising that it doesn't have a completely flat field of focus. That would never really be the design goal around a lens like this. With a lower megapixel body, I'm sure the field distortion isn't gonna even be something to worry about. So, your mileage may vary depending on your personal standards. Here we're being really strict, but that is for your benefit so that you can make the decision with all the information available. Maybe this is a lens for you. If this video has helped you find out, I hate doing the YouTube thing, but I would be much appreciative if you gave it a thumbs up. If you really hated it, I don't know why you made it this far, but by all means, give it a thumbs down. And if you are a chatty person, by all means, please leave a comment. I love talking with folks, especially about this type of stuff. And both the thumbs upping and the commenting, going to be honest, it really helps get these videos seen, and that helps make it worth it. I would love to just, make videos for a couple dozens of people, but I would love it even more if it was a couple of dozens of hundreds or thousands. So I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much, and hopefully we will see you in the next one.